Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. Let me start by saying, get a flu shot. Yes, I know, strains mutate very quickly, big bad pharma, yada, yada, yada. But this is now 2 years in a row I've come down with the flu around the same time of year. And not to get too technical, but it just sucks. It lingers, it keeps me cloudy, and it keeps me curled up in a ball. I leak like a faucet, and yeah, I'm a wimp, but it doesn't matter. If there's something that can reduce the likelihood of getting the flu and it's free, well, I've concluded I'm an idiot for being too lazy to trudge into my local pharmacy and just do it. So I will do it, and I suggest you do too. Next. Today, I want to talk about the Atomos Ninja Inferno, the 7-inch HDMI only monitor recorder we brought with us on our road trip through New Hampshire, Maine, and eastern Long Island. If you saw our previous episode on Zacuto gear we used on the same trip, you'll know that my personal bugaboo isn't LUTs, logs, or whatever third L word would have fit in very beautifully if I'd had the patience, but instead the simple challenge of seeing what I'm shooting in bright light and or at an angle, which is precisely why the Inferno was interesting to me in the first place. So I'll cut straight to it, broken up actually into two parts. Part one. The Inferno is a significant technical update over its predecessor, the Ninja Assassin, especially with firmware update 8.4. Atomos retained all that was good about the Assassin: 4K recording, great focus and exposure assists, high-resolution screen, excellent menu system with one of the best touch interfaces I've ever seen in the industry, use of fast, high-capacity solid-state or spinning disk drives, a pile of codecs, and then improves daylight viewability by raising screen brightness from 400 to 1500 nits, manages to find space for an entire second battery, ups the 4K recording frame rate to 60 FPS, cuts the price by $300 from the Assassin's original launch price of $1295, and introduces new HDR features. So kudos to Atomos for creating a precision tool clearly tailored for the GH5, just as they did with the original Shogun for the Sony a7S, at such an aggressive price point. But this begs larger questions around the magnitude and significance of these differences to you. Because while 10-bit 4K 60p is going to be important to a bunch of folks, remember the GH5 will only record that resolution and frame rate at 8-bit internally. And a $300 price drop, which will be important to a bunch more, I'm betting for most of us the first question has to be, so how much brighter is that? While the second question has to be, so how much longer recording is that? Hold those thoughts, because a number of you will also be interested in the improved support of high dynamic range and hybrid log gamma in 8.4. At which point the third question becomes, what is that exactly and how important is that to whom, when? Hold that thought too. Because with all of this said, there are costs too, though I think they are reasonable. The Inferno is somewhere around 2/3 to 3/4 of an inch thicker and wider and almost a pound heavier than the Assassin. It may look very similar to the Assassin. It's lost the bright orange protective rubber cover, but really, who cares? But this is a new body. Kudos again, Atomos is doing what it takes to make the right product for the GH5, including expensive machining. But these are not the only costs, so hold that thought. Now, to be perfectly candid, up until GH5's firmware version 2.0, I've always been more of a, hey, the Atomos is a great monitor, which just happens to have a built-in recorder that doesn't matter to me, and I don't really want the price or weight penalty of it kind of guy. I'm not a visual effects person. I'm not a green screen person. My gear until the GH5 didn't record in 10 bits. I didn't want the overhead of shooting RAW or ProRes if it wasn't going to significantly change my 8-bit 420 image quality anyway. I like traveling light, so yeah, there's that. But the GH5 does record 10-bit 422, though not just out through HDMI, but internally, as just about everybody now knows, all the way up to 400 megabits per second when shooting all interest. So the fourth question becomes, how much faster or better is recording directly in ProRes than that? Hold that thought too. Finally, if there were good answers to all of these questions, the last question would still have to be, or questions, how much money and weight penalty is all of it, and is it worth it? Okay, The lines have been drawn. Thus, we can now turn our attention to part 2 of the bottom line, which is this. The net result of pairing an upgraded GH5 with an upgraded Ninja is that most shooters who don't already own an Atomos product will appreciate the outstanding interface and assists. All will appreciate the greater brightness. A much smaller group will, like the Inferno itself, which in the end is really designed to do, explore HDR and HLG as they begin to trickle into the mainstream. The flip side is, I'm guessing most of us will find the idea of recording externally for image quality differences less compelling than ever, unless shooting 10-bit 4K 60 frames per second is critical to you. Let's get into some details. First up, brightness. I'd done a little Googling before getting into it with the Inferno, but I'm going to attribute this to my enfeebled mental state from my ongoing battle with the flu. I hadn't found a definitive comparison of nits levels. I still didn't know if this particular measurement is like lumens, EVFs, f-stops, decibels, linear, logarithmic, or other. So while my first guess was that 1500 nits, it is light after all, is just under 2 stops brighter than the 400 nits of the Assassin, it took a long HDMI cable hooked up from the GH5 to the Assassin, a second shorter HDMI cable from the Assassin to the Inferno, 3 tripods, a Sony a6300, and an iPhone, and a pile of LED lights on stands to determine that this is, yeah, about right. In my imprecise testing, the meter on the a6300 helped me deduce a 1.7 stop advantage to the Inferno when both were set to 100% brightness. In other words, almost 4 times as bright. But let me just interject for a moment to talk about the brightness metrics the industry is throwing around these days, because nits, as a late night for him, late afternoon for me Skype call over the weekend with an Atomos bud in the UK revealed, are peak brightness ratings, meaning most of the time you aren't seeing that level of brightness. It's very much like the old audio amplifier ratings games of the 1970s, peak watts versus RMS, root mean square watts. In the end, what was more important was the amount of power delivered most of the time. So back to the real world. It's going to come down to what you see with your own 2 eyes when you're actually on location in bright light. I didn't think 2 stops was going to be a retina frying difference, or shall I say, recalling the occasional synesthesia I have when taking NyQuil, I didn't think this was going to make my ears pop. But I was wrong. When I set up again outside, the difference was dramatic. This alone is reason enough to take a very close look at the Inferno. Or a really, really good hood, not one of those short 3/4 jobs, but more like what Hoodman offers for a number of monitors, though, interestingly enough, not for Atomos, which I find strange. But with this said, both monitors, Inferno and Ninja, suffered equally from glare. And that's just annoying, since the very concept of glare is antithetical to being daylight viewable. Now, I understand why Atomos has done this. The blacks are richer, just like they are when you print on glossy instead of matte print papers, but still. Next, battery life. According to published specs, it turns out the 2 batteries in the Inferno have about the same longevity as one in the Assassin, which is disappointing. But I assume it's a function of the screen being so much brighter, and it's true that these kinds of monitors do suck batteries dry very quickly. And yes, there's great value in being able to hot swap batteries, but if you're going to be shooting all day, if your objective is to minimize the number of distractions or failure points, you'll want a true Cine-style, high-capacity battery with DTAP. It's the better way to go from a workflow perspective, but you'll need proper rigging and the budget for it. I'll put a link to my review of the Sakuto kit we used in the Show More section below and in the upper right corner of the screen for you and on the upper left to me. And thanks to one of you who reached out to me about Small Rig, I have a review coming up of that too, so keep an eye out. In the meantime, if any of you have a particularly sweet setup, please share in the comments section below. Third, dynamic range, hybrid log gamma. Guys, it's still early days for HDR and video. Now, to be honest with myself, as someone who is never going to be a dedicated DP or camera op, but instead will likely always be a 1 or 2 man band whose intrinsic path is words and ideas first, HDR today mostly just annoys the heck out of me because it makes things more complicated and gets in the way of my intent, just like crappy camera body ergonomics. And it begs me to spend more money. But let's talk about it anyway, because limited dynamic range can get in the way of intent when shooting outdoors. It's beautiful when you have it. And forget about me or you, the industry has decided this is the next big thing after VR or AR. On the other hand, hey, let's forget about what the industry has decided just long enough to acknowledge the simple fact that the difference between even the best cameras and displays out there and the human eye is staggering, and the gear loses. Biology is brilliant. The human eye, no religious connotation implied, miraculous. So I get the value of high dynamic range. With this said, I've never warmed to what I'll call first generation HDR, still images for the most part that don't look remotely like what one sees in real life, but instead might best be described as a kind of photorealism inspired by Peter Max, whose work I love, by the way, as originally created. Now, you can argue that Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico by Ansel Adams is in concept no different from HDR, but I'd argue that even if he dodged and burned the heck out of that final image, which he did, printing on paper that, by the way, only has 5 to 7 stops of dynamic range, he managed to create an image very different from what the camera captured, but one that somehow passes an instinctive or emotional sniff test. And for me, that's what's lovely about HDR and video, the promise of capturing more of what the human eye can see, or to put it better yet, what the human eye, brain, and heart together can feel. But at the moment, HDR TVs represent a small fraction of the market. I just saw a report that asserts by 2020, maybe 30% of HDR TVs shipped will have true HDR performance capabilities, whatever that means, even if virtually all of them will be HDR compatible, whatever that means. In 2016, that number was closer to 4%, so the ramp up is clear. Even then, we're talking, what, 11 stops of dynamic range compared to 15 stops of range for the best cameras today and 20 stops for the human eye, and at what bit depth? My brand new 2017 iMac doesn't support an HDR screen, and even with 10 to 10.5 stops, the Inferno isn't officially an HDR10 or HDR10 plus screen either, though if we forget about standards and just look at the thing, it surely is HDR relative to traditional monitors. My point is, if neither you nor I can see the HDR difference in our daily viewing, why bother with it? Well, you bother with it because you know it's coming, you want to get familiar with it before things heat up too quickly, and you want to make money with it. So this is another reason why the Inferno might be interesting to you. Unless it isn't. What Atomos has done with its Atom HDR during this transitional time is figure out how to take advantage of the Inferno's high brightness display and its brilliant interface to create what is essentially a continuously variable set of monitor LUTs across exposures during live view using a simple slider control. Its value is clearest when you're shooting in log and want to envision what the final footage could look like after being properly graded. It's pretty darn cool. But with this said, and given my very clear bias and starting point, I found that not shooting in log and relying solely on the GH5's rear LCD, Panny's Cinity profile, and some simple adjustments in post, I could still get what I consider to be beautiful imagery. Which brings us to hybrid log gamma. Now, the basic ambition for HLG is achieving the same end result as shooting in log and grading in post, graded dynamic range, without shooting in log or grading in post, which is my kind of magic. The way HLG does this is by baking in the curves at the capture point and at the display point, camera and display, using metadata cataloged at capture to tell an official HDR display what to do. What Atomos has done with its HLG support, properly tagging metadata, is important if you're doing HDR and want to get to it without the overhead of log shooting and grading. There's a lot more to say about HLG, like how it's supposed to look okay on Rec 709 TVs as opposed to log, which just looks washed out. And this in turn helps productions like sports not require 2 sets of cameras to cover an event. But I don't have an HLG display, so I'm breaking surface to talk about the answer to the 4th question, which is the advantage of recording directly to ProRes or perhaps Cinema DNG. Again, I cop to not being the primary target audience for this. I would have expected ProRes to have a significant advantage over internally recorded files, but given my subject matter and distribution channel, which is YouTube, and as I always kick off imports to include transcoding and simply walk away from the edit bay when this happens, it's not a significant advantage to my workflow. Though, to be fair, transcoding took much longer for all-I than the usual long GOP. The one other little thing is that the metadata tag coming over to Final Cut Pro 10 from the GH5 doesn't properly show what the codec is. It should read something from the GH5 like all-I, but instead it reads as if someone had just put in some text and said, we'll get to it later, but never did. The metadata from the Atomos had no such problem. The 5th question, weight, size, and the cost of stuff. I don't like mounting something as big and heavy as the Inferno with batteries directly onto the GH5's hot shoe. It leaves me queasy. As I implied earlier, I'd explore attaching the monitor to a camera cage that can properly support the weight. But the Zacuto rig alone can easily equal the price and weight of the GH5 itself, and for many people this will be a bridge too far. In fact, ditto the Inferno all by itself, which at a $995 price point with weight and volume closing in on the GH5, might be another bridge too far. At which point you might seriously consider the monitor-only small HD focus, which although just about half the nits, carrying a marginally lower dots per square inch spec and only 5 inches diagonally, is also half the price at $499 for the monitor alone, and is 1/6 the weight before adding batteries and media. So let me recap. If you're the shooter and the editor, maybe even the director and producer, but in any case, have a keen sense that time is money. You want to record directly to ProRes. You want that 60 frames per second 4K and 10 bits. You want to get more comfortable with HDR and HLG. And you have both the budget and back for a proper rig with Cine battery and enough loaded SSD caddies. The Ninja Inferno is a no-brainer and a bargain at that. To get anywhere close to that brilliant 7-inch display with assists, never mind recording, you're looking at something like the monitor-only $1,500 Small HD 702 Bright at only 1,000 nits, or the even brighter, but triple the price monitor-only $3,000 2200 nits Small HD 703 Ultra Bright. But even then, these monitors won't take in or pass through a 4K signal, and they're just as or slightly heavier, even if they do offer the SDI ports in addition to HDMI that the Ninja Inferno does not. If you still want that 4K recording, the most natural competitor to the Atomos 4K recording line is Convergence Design's now reduced price $1495 Odyssey 7Q Plus. The 7Q Plus offers an even bigger, though lower resolution and brightness 7.7-inch screen, a pile of SDI inputs and outputs along with a mini HDMI in and out, a comparable pile of codecs, comparable use of SSD or spinning media, comparable weight rate, but lower frame rates and an interface only a mother could love. Of course, if SDI is important, you could move up to the Shogun Inferno, which sells for $1295 naked, and has the ability to record up to the same 60 frames per second in full 4K and up to 240 frames per second in full HD. Or you could spend the same $995 on the Shogun Flame, which is the same price as the Inferno, includes SDI ports, but omits the 4K 10-bit 60 frame per second capability. Now, back at the low end, you could also split the difference between the Ninja Inferno and Small HD Focus by ponying up $795 for the 30 frames per second in 4K limited HDMI only Ninja Flame. You'd also do well to check out Blackmagic's $850 Video Assist 4K, which has the advantage of using less expensive SD cards. Like the Inferno and Flame, it has a beautiful touch interface with robust assists with its latest firmware release, an equally high resolution 1900 by 1200 display, the additional benefit of SDI ports in and out as well as HDMI, 2 mini XLR inputs, but uses a pair of smaller Canon-style batteries and isn't nearly as bright at 350 nits. In the end, what makes the GH5 spectacular is how much Panasonic has been able to package into so little, and the key parameter for how attractive the Ninja Inferno is to you probably rests on that one word, little. For someone like me, the key to the GH5 begins with unlimited recording time in a petite, relatively affordable, interchangeable lens, hybrid form factor camera, and ends with how much it can grow with me as my skills and ambition dictate. The assists are already in there. Not as nice as on the Inferno. 10-bit 422 internal recording is already in there. Higher frame rates are already in there. I mean, it's just peerless at anywhere near the price. But when you add the Inferno to the GH5, you're adding a whole lot of big. As I've said, it doubles the size and weight of the GH5 even before you add in the rigging you may want for it, and actually doubles the price once you add in a Cine battery and an appropriately sized SSD if you don't have them already. On the other hand, the Inferno is also a big improvement in the ease of use for and viewability of assists, composition, and post-processing workflow, and the only way to get 10-bit 4K 60p. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Which way to go? GH5 with all this stuff, or something like an FS7, FS7 II, C200, or EVA1 without it, or a GH5 naked? I don't think it's clear-cut unless you have a very specific needs and budget which drive you to an obvious choice. Now, as for me, well, in spite of the fact that we record internally and don't like carrying extra weight, when we shoot commercially or for documentary work, we always have either a Ninja Assassin or Blackmagic Video 4K clamped to a tripod leg. Yeah, a tripod leg. Which is why I'm looking so closely at rigs these days. It's really splitting the baby. If we didn't already have a 7-inch monitor, it would actually be the Ninja Flame, which would be at the top of our list. Though I will have to go hands-on with a small HD focus. And as always, your mileage may vary. Which brings us to one final thought. For those of us who need, want, or insist on traveling light and cheap, I think Atomos is perhaps missing a market opportunity that small HD is not. 7-inch and maybe 5-inch high brightness monitors without recorders. I don't know how much cheaper they could actually make them. I mean, after all, it would require new tooling, and then Atomos would have to amortize that cost all over again across the new units. But at a price point even modestly lower than the Flame at 7 inches, and approaching the price point of the small HD Focus at 5 inches, hopefully lighter and thinner than the combo monitor recorders, perhaps even paired with the option of a power station to keep the weight of the batteries off the monitor itself, I think Atomos could have a couple of home runs on its hands. Then again, I've been a statistical outlier before, and I might be one now. Anyway, if you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below, share, add to a playlist. Consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links, or even making a contribution directly via the PayPal link below. As always, we thank you for it. For 3 Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.